All right, let's dive into this, shall we? Predictably Irrational by Dan O'Reilly. This book is all about, how our brains, like yours and mine, make decisions that seem, like totally logical at the time, but are actually, well, kind of wacky when you look back.
Yeah, and what I really like about Ari Lee's approach is he doesn't just point fingers at our flawed thinking, right? He actually breaks down why these irrationalities happen and how we can use that knowledge to make better choices, which is, I think, really empowering.
Okay, so let's jump into it. Ehrlich starts off with this idea of relativity, which basically means we don't evaluate things in isolation. Our choices are heavily influenced by how things compare to each other. Like, have you ever seen a product that's way overpriced next to a slightly less expensive but still kind of pricey option, and suddenly that second one just seems like a steal?
Totally. Yeah. Like, our brains are wired to compare things side by side, even if those comparisons don't make logical sense. Ari Lee, he uses this great example from The Economist, right? They offered these 3 subscription options. Online only for a decent price, print only for a higher price, or both online and print for that same higher price.
So people flocked the combo deal,
Yeah,
right?
you bet.
Even though, it made it seem like they were getting something extra when really they were just being nudged into spending more money.
Yeah, exactly. That less appealing print-only option, it wasn't really there to sell subscriptions, it was a decoy. Cleverly designed to make that combined option seem irresistible.
So it's not just about getting a good deal, it's about how our brains perceive value, like in relation to other options. It's like our brains are constantly playing this game of which one is the better deal, even if all the options are kind of bad.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just limited to pricing either, right? Think about house hunting, for example. Imagine you're being shown 2 similar houses in your price range, but one needs a new roof
Right.
and is slightly cheaper. Chances are you'll probably be drawn to the house that doesn't need those repairs, even if, objectively, the fixer-upper might be a better value. That less desirable option is sort of like an anchor, right? Shifting your perception of what a good deal is.
It's kind of sneaky, right? This relativity thing is happening in the background of our brains all the time and influencing our choices without us even knowing it. It really makes you wonder, have you ever been the decoy friend brought along to make someone else seem more appealing?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, let's move on to another concept, right? Anchoring. This is the idea that our initial exposure to a number, even if it's completely random, can have a huge impact on how we evaluate things later on.
So Ariely does this crazy experiment with MIT students where he has them write down the last 2 digits of their social security numbers and then bid on items like, chocolate or wine. What happened?
Well, the students with higher digits ended up bidding way more for those items.
Right.
Even though those numbers obviously had absolutely nothing to do with the value of those items, right? It's as if their minds, latched onto those arbitrary numbers as a starting point and then adjusted their valuations accordingly.
That's wild. And they asked the students if they thought their social security numbers had anything to do with their bids, and they were adamant. No way.
Right.
But the data told a very different story.
The data always tells the truth.
It does.
This anchoring effect, it's everywhere. And it's not just those random numbers either. Think about a product that you've been buying for a while, right? Do you ever find yourself kind of anchored to that initial price that you paid, even if the market value has changed? I think that's anchoring too, right?
Yeah, totally. So basically, we're all susceptible to this kind of mental manipulation. It's like our brains are always looking for shortcuts, even if those shortcuts lead to irrational decisions. Which, it's kind of scary, but also really fascinating, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered relativity and anchoring. What other predictable irrationalities are lurking in our brains? Airly, hit us with another one. What about free E? The magic word. I know I cannot resist a buy one, get one free offer.
You and everybody else.
Right. But is there something more to it than just getting a good deal?
There's definitely something more to it. Ehrlich's research shows that free has this incredibly powerful emotional pull. Even when it leads to demonstrably irrational decisions. He did this experiment with Lindt truffles and Hershey's Kisses, right? Where people could choose between a truffle for 15 cents and a kiss for 1 cent.
So most people went for the truffle, I'm guessing.
Right, the rational choice. But then they offered the truffle for 14 cents and the kiss for free, and
everyone went crazy for the free kisses.
Exactly.
Even though technically they were getting a worse deal. It's like that free evil. it just short-circuits our brains.
It really does. The mere presence of free just triggers this sense of excitement. It removes that perceived risk of loss, right? So suddenly we're not even thinking about the actual value of the product. We're just focused on getting something for nothing.
I've fallen for that so many times. Like those free shipping offers online, you end up spending more just to qualify for the free shipping, you know? Like, classic.
It's a classic marketing tactic for sure.
So what's the takeaway here? How do we resist the allure of free E when it's constantly being dangled in front of us?
Well, the first step, as always, is just being aware of it. Once we understand how this bias works, we can start to make more conscious choices, right? Ask yourself, do I really need this? Would I buy this if it wasn't free? That kind of thing. It might help you avoid those impulse purchases that you regret later.
Okay, I'm feeling a little less irrational already. But you know what? There's still one big hurdle I face, like on a daily basis. Procrastination. Why is it so hard to just get things done, even when we know we should?
Well, Aristotle tackled this very issue with his students. He gave them different deadline options for their papers. Some had no deadline, some could set their own, and some had fixed deadlines set by him.
I'm guessing the ones with no deadlines just partied all semester and failed.
Not quite. Interestingly, the students who could set their own deadlines actually performed the best, but there was a catch. They had penalties for missing those deadlines. It seems like having those self-imposed deadlines, even with consequences, was kind of like the secret sauce.
So what's the lesson here for those of us who are not in school anymore? Is there a way to apply this to real life? Like saving for retirement or cleaning out that closet that's been haunting me?
Totally. It's all about pre-commitment, right? We need to design systems that hold us accountable, even if we're the ones who are setting those systems up. It's like having an accountability buddy for your goals, someone who will cheer you on, but also call you out when you start to slack off.
So instead of relying on willpower alone, which can be pretty flimsy, let's be honest, we need to create structures and systems that support our goals. It's about knowing that we're going to procrastinate and then kind of outsmarting our future selves.
Exactly.
By setting up these guardrails that keep us on track. Okay, so we've tackled relativity, anchoring, the allure of free and the challenge of procrastination. I'm starting to see how predictable our irrationality really is.
Yeah.
But what about the power of our minds? Can our beliefs actually influence our physical experiences? Like I've heard of those crazy experiments where people get real pain relief from taking a sugar pill just because they believe it's a painkiller.
That's the placebo effect. You might think of placebos as just, like sugar pills or fake treatments, but it's way more complex than that.
Right.
Early talks about these studies where people underwent sham surgeries for angina and knee pain. And even though the procedures were completely fake, the patients reported significant and lasting relief.
It's not just tricking people into thinking they're getting a real treatment, right? There's something deeper going on. Like the power of belief and expectation is somehow influencing our physical responses.
Absolutely. The placebo effect demonstrates this incredible power of that mind-body connection. Our thoughts, our beliefs, our expectations can have a huge impact on our physical experiences, even in ways that we don't fully understand.
I mean, it's both fascinating and a little bit unsettling, right? If our minds are that powerful, does that mean we're just all walking around in a self-created reality?
That's a good question. And the placebo effect, it's not limited to pain relief either. Studies have shown that it can be effective for a whole range of conditions, from depression to Parkinson's disease. It's really a testament to how adaptable our brains are and the potential of using bluff, for healing and well-being.
This is really blowing my mind. I need a minute to process all of this. Okay, I think I'm ready for our next deep dive. Let's talk about dishonesty. We like to think of ourselves as honest people, but are we really?
That's a good question, and one that Aristotle definitely tackles. His research shows that dishonesty is way more common than we might like to think. And it's not just about a few bad apples, right? It's about how we're all susceptible to these moral slippages, especially when the stakes are low and the consequences seem really minimal.
So he did this experiment where people could cheat on a test to earn more money. But what's really interesting is even when they knew they wouldn't get caught, they still limited their cheating. It's like there was some sort of internal limit that they just wouldn't cross.
Exactly. We want to, maintain this positive self-image. So we tend to limit our dishonesty to a point where we can still kind of rationalize it to ourselves. It's what Aristotle calls the fudge factor. It's like that gray area where we kind of bend the rules without completely breaking them.
So it's not necessarily about being inherently good or bad. It's about navigating this complex moral landscape, right?
Yeah.
Where we're balancing our self-interest with wanting to feel like we have integrity.
Exactly. And the context can really play a huge role, right? They did another experiment where they left cans of Coke and plates of dollar bills in college dorm refrigerators.
I'm sensing a theme here, Coke versus cash.
Well, what do you think disappeared faster?
The Coke, probably. Who can resist a free soda, right?
Got it. But here's the thing. The money was largely untouched. It seems like there's something about stealing, like, physical objects that feels wrong in a way that taking something intangible like money doesn't.
It's like we've got these mental loopholes that allow us to justify certain types of dishonesty, right?
Hmm.
While we're condemning others.
It's all part of our predictable irrationality.
All right, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's take a quick breather and just recap what we've learned so far. We started with relativity, the idea that our choices are heavily influenced by how things compare to each other, even if those comparisons are completely illogical. Then we moved on to anchoring, this fascinating idea that our initial exposure to a number, even a random one, can totally skew our later judgments. We explore the irresistible lure of free and how it can just short-circuit our rational decision-making processes. We tackle the age-old problem of procrastination and how pre-commitment can be such a powerful tool for overcoming that tendency to just put things off. We delved into the mind-blowing world of placebos, where the power of belief can actually influence our physical experiences. And we confronted well, let's be honest, the uncomfortable truth about dishonesty and how we're all susceptible to those moral slippages, especially when the stakes are low. So are you feeling irrational yet?
It's a lot to take in, but I think the takeaway here is that by understanding these predictable patterns, we can actually start to make more conscious and informed and ultimately more rational decisions.
So stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into Predictably Irrational, where we'll explore even more fascinating insights into how our wonderfully weird minds work.
It's fascinating how Airlie uses his own, life experiences to illustrate these principles. He talks about his time recovering in a burn ward after this terrible accident and, imagine having to change your bandages every day. And it's so painful that even morphine barely helps.
Oh, that just sounds excruciating. I can't even imagine. What does that have to do with irrationality?
Well, Airlie noticed that the nurses, even though they obviously had the best intentions, they were actually making the pain worse by ripping the bandages off really quickly.
Huh?
And he, being, kind of a nerd, even while he's in agonizing pain, started thinking about how we perceive pain, right? And he suggested this slower, less intense approach to changing the bandages.
So he used his understanding of irrationality to, actually improve his own treatment, even in that kind of situation. That's amazing. Did it work?
It did, yeah. And that experience really sparked his broader interest in how we make decisions, especially when those decisions lead to, repeated mistakes. It's like those, expensive coffee shops that we talked about earlier. They're not just selling coffee, they're selling an experience, an ambiance. And that really influences how much we're willing to pay.
It's like we get anchored to those high prices and start associating them with quality, even if the coffee itself isn't actually that much better.
Right. And speaking of getting anchored, Airlie talks about this fascinating phenomenon called arbitrary coherence.
Yeah.
It's the idea that the initial prices we encounter, even if they're completely random, can, shape our willingness to pay for things later on.
Yeah.
He tells this really interesting story about Tahitian black pearls, which are basically, unknown. They had no real market demand.
So how did they become so valuable?
Well, this clever pearl king named Salvador Asel, he had a strategy. He anchored those pearls to the highest end gemstones, showcasing them alongside diamonds and rubies in fancy stores and magazines.
So he basically rebranded them as luxury items.
Exactly. By associating those pearls with luxury and prestige, he created this perception of high value, even though their intrinsic qualities, hadn't changed at all. And it worked. People started paying a fortune for those pearls.
It's a reminder that we're not always as rational as we think we are, right? Our perceptions of value, they're constantly being shaped by external forces, whether it's marketing, social cues, or even just random numbers.
It's a good reminder to always, question our assumptions about value. Ask ourselves, is this really worth the price? Or am I being influenced by, some kind of arbitrary anchor?
Okay, so we're getting pretty good at spotting these irrationalities, but what about our own past behavior? Can that influence our decisions even if we, know better?
Absolutely. There's this concept called self-hurting, which is basically the idea that we tend to like follow our own past behavior, even if the initial justification for that behavior, no longer holds true.
Can you give me an example? Self-hurting, that sounds kind of abstract.
Okay, so think about Starbucks, right? You walk in for the first time, maybe you're kind of shocked by the prices, but you're curious. You buy a coffee, you'll like it. And then the next time you need a caffeine fix, you find yourself back at Starbucks, right? Justifying the high price because of that one past positive experience.
It's like I'm being hurted by my past self. It makes sense though, right? We're creatures of habit. And once we establish a pattern of behavior, it can be really hard to break free, even if we know it's not like the most rational or, cost-effective choice.
Exactly. And speaking of patterns of behavior, let's talk about another challenge that we often face. The struggle to make decisions when we've got like way too many options. We've all felt that overwhelming feeling of choice overload, right?
Ugh, yes. Too many options can be paralyzing. It's like trying to choose a movie on Netflix. I spend more time browsing than I do actually watching anything.
Airly frames this in the context of like keeping doors open. We have this innate desire to keep all of our options open, even if it means, spreading ourselves too thin or maybe missing out on some great opportunities. He tells this incredible story about this Chinese commander, Shang Yu, who before this huge battle, he burned his ships and smashed all of his cooking pots.
Wait, what? Why would he do that? That sounds crazy.
It does. It seems really counterintuitive. But his point was to eliminate any chance of retreat. By closing off those doors, he focused his troops' minds on, the task at hand, winning the battle.
So it's like a strategic form of self-sabotage. It sounds extreme, but I kind of get the logic. By limiting our options, we can sometimes actually increase our focus and, improve our chances of success.
Exactly. Sometimes less is more. Making a decision and actually committing to it can be more beneficial than trying to keep all of our options open all the time.
It's like that saying, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
Hmm.
But even when we do make a choice and commit to it, there's this other, irrationality lurking in the shadows. The sunk cost fallacy. And this is something I definitely struggle with all the time.
Oh, tell me about it.
Right.
The sunk cost fallacy. It's this idea that we're, reluctant to give up on something, even if it's clearly not working out because we've already invested so much time or money or effort into it.
It's like when you're in this really long line at the grocery store and you refuse to leave, even if there's a shorter line opening up because you already invested, so much time waiting. Or you keep pouring money into a project that's clearly failing, even though, rationally, you should cut your losses.
Airily uses this example of agonizing over whether to stay at MIT or move to Stanford, right? He spent weeks researching, comparing, just agonizing over these two options, even though objectively they were both equally appealing in a lot of ways.
It's like we get so emotionally attached to those sunk costs, even if they don't make sense anymore. It's hard to overcome. But I guess the key is just recognizing when we're falling into that trap and ask ourselves, am I holding on to this because it's actually the best choice? Or am I just afraid to admit I made a mistake?
It's a good question to ask yourself, for sure. And speaking of good questions, let's explore how our first impressions can really shape our perceptions, sometimes in really surprising ways. Airily did some intriguing research on this using taste tests. He and his colleagues offered students two different types of beer, one regular and one that was, laced with balsamic vinegar.
Balsamic vinegar and beer. That sounds interesting.
Right. Well, when the students didn't know about the vinegar, they often preferred the vinegar-laced beer. But when they were told about it beforehand, their reactions were totally different. They wrinkled their noses, made faces, and opted for the regular beer instead.
So their expectations based on just the description totally changed their experience. That's wild.
It's a really clear example of how our expectations can, really impact our perceptions, even when it comes to something as subjective as taste. It's like when someone tells you a movie is terrible and you go in expecting to hate it. You're much more likely to find fault with it, right? Even if you might have actually enjoyed it otherwise.
It's like those wine descriptions on menus, right? They use all this fancy language like notes of blackberry and oak or hints of vanilla and spice. They're setting an expectation, like a framework for how you're going to experience the taste.
Exactly. And it's not just about taste either, right? Our expectations can, they can influence our perceptions of people, places, experiences of all kinds. It's a good reminder to be mindful of how our preconceived notions, both good and bad, can sort of color our perceptions and influence how we judge things.
So should we just like, try to ignore our expectations altogether?
Yeah. I don't think it's about ignoring them. It's more about, recognizing that they're there and trying to approach each experience with a more, I guess, open mind. Sometimes our expectations can enhance our enjoyment, but other times they can kind of limit our perspective, right? And prevent us from seeing things clearly.
It's like that saying, don't judge a book by its cover. But what about those unconscious biases that we all have? Can those also, like, influence our behavior?
Oh, for sure. Airlie talks about some really fascinating research on how stereotypes can actually influence our behavior. In one study, they had people unscramble sentences that contain words related to either politeness or rudeness.
I bet the ones who are, like, primed with the polite words were more likely to, hold the door open for
You got
someone.
it. They were also way more likely to wait longer before they would interrupt a conversation, compared to those who unscrambled sentences with those rude words. It's fascinating how these really subtle cues can activate like social scripts in our minds and influence our actions, right? Even if we're not even aware of it.
So it's not just about, like, our conscious thoughts and beliefs, right? It's about these deeper unconscious patterns that are kind of constantly at work shaping how we see the world and how we behave in it.
Absolutely. And they did this other really interesting experiment where they primed people with words that were related to being elderly. And you know what? Their walking speed actually slowed down.
Wait, are you serious? Just thinking about words like Florida and bingo can make you walk slower.
It sounds crazy, but that's what the research suggests. It just shows how powerful these unconscious influences can be. Our minds are constantly picking up information from our surroundings, and those inputs, even if they seem small or insignificant, they can have, real measurable impacts on how we behave.
It's like we're all living in this giant social experiment where we're being bombarded with messages and cues that are kind of shaping our thoughts and feelings and actions, without us even realizing it. It's both fascinating and a little bit creepy.
It is. It's a good reminder to just be more mindful of the messages that we're taking in and how they might be, shaping us. And to really drive this point home, Airlie tells this amazing story about Joshua Bell, this like world-renowned violinist. He played incognito in a busy subway station.
Wait, I think I've heard of this. Didn't people just, like, walk right by him?
They did. Most people just rushed by, barely noticing him. Only a handful stopped to listen, and even fewer actually donated any money. It was as if his extraordinary talent was totally invisible, right? Because it didn't fit into their expectations of what a subway musician should be.
It makes you wonder how much beauty and brilliance we miss out on in our everyday lives just because we're not really paying attention, or because, maybe our expectations are blinding us.
It's a good reminder to, challenge our assumptions and approach the experience with a really open mind. You never know what you might discover, right? When you step outside your comfort zone and embrace the unexpected.
This whole conversation is really giving me a new perspective on how our minds work and how susceptible we are to, all these biases and irrationalities. But let's jump back into the mind-blowing world of placebos for a second. We talked about how powerful the placebo effect can be, but can we actually, like, harness this power for good?
That's a great question, and one that scientists and researchers are really exploring. Airlie shares a personal anecdote about his own experience with the placebo effect. He talks about this product called Airborne. You know those fizzy tablets that you dissolve in water?
Yeah, I've used those before. I don't know if they actually work, but I always feel better after I take one.
Exactly. Airlie knew that Airborne was probably just a placebo, but, the ritual of taking it, the fizzing, the taste, it all made him feel better. He even admits to feeling less stressed and more confident about his health after taking it.
So it's not about tricking yourself into believing something that's not true.
Right.
It's about acknowledging that our minds have a powerful influence on our well-being, and that even, placebo rituals can have this positive impact on our health and happiness.
It's really an intriguing area of research with so much potential. Now, are you ready for another deep dive into the shadowy world of dishonesty?
Bring it on. I'm starting to see that honesty is a lot more complicated than I originally thought.
Well, Airlie's research shows that dishonesty is much more common than we might like to think. And it's not just about a few bad apples, it's about how we're all susceptible to these moral slippages, especially when the stakes are low and the consequences seem minimal.
He talks about those experiments where people could cheat on a test to earn more money. And the really surprising thing was, even when they knew they wouldn't get caught, they still limited their cheating. Like, there was this internal limit that they just wouldn't cross.
Right, we want to maintain, a positive self-image. So we tend to limit our dishonesty to a point where we can still justify it to ourselves. It's that, fudge factor again, that gray area where we sort of bend the rules without completely breaking them.
So it's not about being inherently good or bad. It's about this like constant negotiation between our desire to, you know, benefit from dishonesty and then our need to still feel like we have some integrity.
Exactly. And the context can play a huge role in shaping our moral choices. They did this other experiment where they left cans of Coke and plates of dollar bills in college dorm refrigerators.
Coke versus cash.
Guess what disappeared faster?
I'm going to guess the Coke again.
Exactly. But the interesting thing is the money was mostly untouched. It seems like there's something about stealing physical objects that just feels more wrong than taking something less tangible, like cash.
It's like we have this, mental block against physically stealing, even if the value is the same.
And to explore these nuances even further, they did another experiment where they gave participants tokens that they could later exchange for money.
So it's like a two-step process.
Exactly. And what they found was that those who received tokens actually cheated more than those who got cash directly. It's as if that extra step, of exchanging tokens for money created a psychological distance that made it easier to justify the dishonesty.
It's like those gift cards that make it so much easier to overspend because you're not actually handing over like physical cash. It's really interesting how these seemingly small details can have such a significant impact on like our moral compass.
It's all part of our predictable irrationality. Now let's step outside the lab for a second and talk about a real-world social experiment. Burning Man, have you heard of it?
Oh yeah, Burning Man. It's that crazy festival in the desert where people build those giant art installations and wear like outrageous costumes.
That's the one. Ariely spent some time there, and he talks about it as a fascinating example of what happens when we try to, remove money from the equation.
So is it like a temporary utopia where everybody shares and cooperates?
It's not quite that simple, but it does challenge our assumptions about, human nature and the role that money plays in society. At Burning Man, people barter, they gift, and they collaborate in ways that you just don't see in the regular world. It's really a fascinating glimpse into the possibilities of, maybe a more communal, less transactional way of life.
It makes you wonder, like what aspects of our lives could we actually improve if we took money out of the equation? Are there areas where we could foster, more of a sense of community and shared responsibility without relying on these financial incentives?
It's a good question, and one that Burning Man offers, a compelling, albeit temporary, example of how it might actually be possible. But let's bring it back to our own personal decision-making for a second. Ariely did this study that really highlights, I think, the duality of human nature. Our rational side versus, that impulsive side.
I think I can relate to that. Sometimes it feels like I'm battling with two different versions of myself.
Right. Well, in this study, he asked participants to think about their sexual and moral decisions. First in a cold state of mind, when they're calm and collected, and then again when they were in a more, I guess, aroused state of mind.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What did he find?
The findings were actually really surprising. People totally underestimated how much passion would actually influence their choices. It's like there's this disconnect between, our rational selves and our emotional selves.
Oh, I've definitely experienced that. Like when you're calm and you can, make a plan to eat healthy and exercise, but then you find yourself at a party surrounded by like delicious food and all those good intentions just poof, disappear.
Yep. It shows how important it is to just recognize the power that emotions have.
Yeah.
And how they can really sway our judgment.
So it's not about like suppressing our emotions or ignoring them. It's about being aware of their influence and having, some strategies in place to help us make more rational choices, even when our emotions are running high.
I think so. Now, to illustrate this even further, Ariely shares this really personal story. He talks about having to give himself these daily injections of interferon as part of a medical treatment.
Oh, that sounds unpleasant. What was the treatment for?
It doesn't really matter for the story. The point is these injections were awful. I mean, we're talking fever, chills, vomiting, the whole 9 yards. It was enough to make anybody want to quit. But Ariely, being Ariely, he came up with this really clever strategy to overcome his aversion to these injections.
I'm guessing it involves some kind of like an irrationality hack.
You bet. He decided to reward himself with movies after every injection. He would go to the video store, before streaming, and pick out a whole stack of movies he wanted to watch, and then, brace himself and give himself the injection. And afterward, he would get to relax, in his hammock and enjoy his movie marathon.
It's genius. He took something he dreaded and turn it into something pleasurable by associating it with this reward. It's like, training yourself to like broccoli by dipping it in cheese sauce.
Exactly. It's about, pairing something that maybe we dislike, but we know is good for us with something that we really enjoy.
It's such a good reminder that we can use our own like desires and motivations to overcome those challenges and stick to our goals, right?
Yeah.
We just have to be creative and find those little tricks that work for us.
Exactly. Now, ready to talk about something a bit more relatable, something that tends to evoke, a lot of strong emotions and often leads to irrational decisions.
Hit me with it. I'm feeling brave.
Let's talk about buying and selling a house.
Oh boy. I've heard so many stories about like the emotional roller coaster of real estate. Bidding wars, seller's remorse, buyer's frenzy. It all sounds like, a recipe for irrationality.
You're not wrong. Lee talks about this phenomenon called the endowment effect, which is basically this tendency to overvalue the things that we own.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, right? We get attached to our things and it's hard to let go, even if, logically it makes sense. Can you give me an example?
He tells the story about this experiment where they gave students tickets to a Duke University basketball game. These tickets are like notoriously hard to get. Some students were randomly chosen to be sellers, while others were buyers. And, guess what happened?
The sellers wanted way more for their tickets than the buyers were willing to pay.
Exactly. The sellers, just because they now owned the tickets, they valued them much higher than the buyers did. It's as if just owning something, even for a short time, inflates its value in our minds.
It's that old saying, one man's trash is another man's treasure. But in this case, it's more like, once it's mine, it's priceless.
Exactly. And they replicated this effect with, something as simple as a coffee mug. They randomly assign participants to be either buyers or sellers. And guess what? The sellers consistently put a higher price on their mugs than the buyers are willing to pay, even though the mugs were totally identical.
So it's not about the actual value of the object. It's about this psychological sense of ownership. Once we feel like something is ours, we're just less willing to part with it, even if it makes financial sense.
It's a really powerful bias, and it has implications for, all kinds of transactions, from selling a car to negotiating a salary. It's just a good reminder to be aware of this tendency, ourselves and in others when we're in these situations.
So how do we overcome this endowment effect? Is there a way to, emotionally detach from our possessions and make more rational decisions?
It's not easy, but the first step, as always, is awareness. Once we understand how this bias works, we can start to, question our own valuations and try to see things from the other person's perspective.
So it's like taking a step back and saying, okay, if I didn't already own this, how much would I actually be willing to pay for it?
Exactly. And to really illustrate just how strong this effect can be, Lee shares his personal experience of selling his house in Cambridge. They'd put a lot of time and effort into renovating it, creating this really beautiful, open, airy space that they absolutely loved.
So they were pretty attached to it.
Yeah, you could say that. But when it came time to sell, potential buyers just didn't share their enthusiasm. People wanted, more privacy, more defined spaces. It was a hard lesson to learn, but it really highlighted how our personal tastes and preferences, they don't always align with what the market actually wants.
It's a good reminder for anyone who's, thinking about selling their house or any other prized possession for that matter. What we value in our own stuff isn't always what other people are going to find appealing.
And then there's this other layer of complexity, this thing called virtual ownership.
Virtual ownership. That sounds futuristic. What is that?
It's the idea that we can start to feel ownership over something even before we actually own it. You see this a lot in online auctions where people get so caught up in the excitement of bidding, they start to feel like that item is already theirs, even if they haven't actually won the auction yet.
Yeah, you get invested in the process and it starts to feel personal. I get it.
Exactly. And that sense of virtual ownership, it can lead to some pretty irrational bidding behavior. Lee and his colleagues did this experiment where they simulated an online auction for a $50 gift certificate. And what they found was the longer the auction went on, the more the highest bidders started to feel the sense of ownership over that certificate. And that led them to bid higher and higher, often exceeding the actual value of the certificate.
It's like they couldn't bear the thought of losing something that, in their minds, they already possessed, even if it was just virtual.
It's a reminder to be aware of how virtual experiences, from auctions to social media, they can really, play with our emotions and influence our decisions. Just because something feels real online doesn't mean that it actually is. And speaking of things that feel real but might not be, let's talk about those 30-day money-back guarantees that retailers love to offer.
I always thought those were a good thing. Like, it makes it less risky to try something new, right?
They can be, but they can also kind of backfire in a way. The problem is, once we, bring something home, we start to feel like we own it, and returning it starts to feel like this, like, loss, even if we don't actually like the product all that much.
I know exactly what you mean. It's like trying on clothes in a store. You might love something on the rack, but once you've tried it on and looked at yourself in the mirror, it's so much harder to resist buying it, right?
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't fit perfectly or it's not really your style.
It's all about that power of possession, even if it's just temporary. Those money-back guarantees, they can give us this, like, false sense of security, making us more likely to buy things that we might not otherwise.
So it's another one of those mental loopholes, that retailers use to play on our predictable irrationality. They're really playing chess with our brains.
You could say that. And to add a little humor to this discussion, Ariely tells this funny story about his experience with a toll-free number for, I think, a company that makes mattresses. And apparently he and his wife could not remember the name of the company, so they spent like forever trying to guess the toll-free number.
Oh, no. I've totally been there before. You get fixated on an idea and you just can't let it go, even if it's not working. Did they ever figure it out?
They did, eventually. But they tried all these different combinations based on their vague memory of the company's name. And, nothing worked. It just shows how our brains can get stuck in a loop, like fixated on finding a solution, even when that solution might be totally elusive or, irrelevant.
It's a good reminder to just step back sometimes and like reassess our approach. You know, maybe there's a simpler or more effective way to achieve our goals. Maybe we're just, overthinking things.
Exactly. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. Now, you ready for another round of truth or consequences? Let's talk about dishonesty again.
Bring it on. I'm really fascinated by this whole idea that, we're all capable of dishonesty, even if we think of ourselves as good people.
Well, Aries research shows that dishonesty is more prevalent than we might like to think, and it's not just about a few bad apples. It's about how we're all susceptible to these moral slippages, especially when the stakes are low and the consequences seem really minimal.
He talks about how even seemingly insignificant factors, like the presence of a moral reminder, can influence our honesty, right? Like that experiment where they asked people to recall the 10 Commandments before they took a test where they had an opportunity to cheat.
Right. And what they found was that those who were, reminded of the Ten Commandments actually cheated less than those who weren't. It's as if those moral guidelines, even if they weren't, consciously thinking about them, they still activated this sense of accountability.
So it's not just about our personal moral compass. It's also about the cues that we get from our environment.
Right.
It makes you think about how important it is to create, ethical environments that actually encourage honesty and integrity.
It's an important consideration for sure.
Mhm.
And to add another layer of complexity, there's that, fudge factor that we talked about earlier.
Remind me what that is again.
It's basically that idea that we all have this internal limit to how much we're willing to, cheat or lie. We want to maintain this positive self-image. So we tend to limit our dishonesty to a point where we can still kind of, rationalize it to ourselves.
It's like telling a little white lie to avoid hurting someone's feelings.
Ah.
Right? We can rationalize that as being, for the greater good, even if it's technically dishonest.
It's a really complex interplay between our desire to, benefit from dishonesty and our need to maintain this sense of integrity.
It's like we're constantly recalibrating our moral compass based on the situation, right? The potential rewards, the perceived consequences. It's all a balancing act.
Exactly. And to illustrate just how widespread this tendency is, Ariely talks about, the prevalence of dishonesty in various professions, from lawyers to journalists to financial advisors.
Wow. Sounds like no profession is immune. I guess we all have our, blind spots, our moments of weakness.
It seems that way. He cites these studies showing how lawyers, they often struggle with ethical dilemmas. Journalists, they sometimes bend the truth, to get a good story. Financial advisors, they can prioritize their own profits over their clients' best interests.
It's a sobering reminder that even people in positions of, authority and trust can fall prey to temptation.
Yeah.
It really highlights the need for, transparency and accountability and those strong ethical guidelines in, I think, all professions.
Absolutely. It's about creating systems and cultures that encourage honesty rather than relying on, individuals to always do the right thing.
Okay, let's lighten things up a bit. What about those everyday situations where, you know, we're influenced by, like, social pressures to make irrational decisions?
Well, Airlie and his colleagues did this really interesting experiment where they had people order beer. They could either order it, in private by just writing down their choice, or they had to announce it publicly to the table.
Another beer experiment. What happened this time?
What they found was that people ordered differently when they had to, say it out loud. When they were ordering publicly, they tended to choose a wider variety of beers, even if it meant, like, picking something they didn't actually want.
So they were more concerned with, like, how their choices would be perceived by others than by, what they actually wanted to drink.
Exactly. It's as if they were trying to, impress their friends or demonstrate their sophisticated taste.
It's like when you're at a party and you feel pressured to try all the fancy appetizers, even if you'd rather just have, like, a slice of pizza.
Exactly. Social pressures, they can really influence our choices, even in simple situations like, ordering a drink.
It's a good reminder to be aware of those influences and really make choices that, align with our own preferences, not just what we think other people will approve of.
Now, in the final chapter of his book, Airlie kind of shifts his focus to, like, these broader economic questions, especially in light of, the 2008 financial crisis. Are you ready to dive into the world of high finance?
Let's do it. I'm curious to hear what Ariely has to say about the economy and how, our irrationality might be playing a role in, like, these global financial crises.
Well, he starts by reflecting on the limitations of, like, traditional economics,
Hmm.
which assumes that people are rational actors,
Hmm.
making decisions based on this clear understanding of costs and benefits.
It sounds like a pretty idealistic view of human nature, given, everything we've been talking about.
Yeah. Airlie argues that this traditional model, it doesn't take into account, all those ways in which we're predictably irrational.
So he's basically saying that our emotional biases and, all those cognitive shortcuts that we take, they're messing with the economy.
You could say that. He talks about the dangers of assuming that people can actually accurately assess risk, especially when it comes to those really complex financial products like mortgages. And he points to the subprime mortgage crisis as a prime example of how this assumption can lead to, like, really disastrous consequences.
Host, speaker.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that trust is so fragile. And once it's broken, it can be incredibly difficult to, rebuild. It makes you wonder, how do we create systems and institutions that, like, foster trust instead of eroding it?
Yeah, it's a crucial question and one that Airlie explores. And then, he shifts his focus to this really complex issue of executive compensation, particularly in light of those massive bailouts that were given to banks during that whole financial crisis. You remember those?
Oh, yeah. Those were controversial for sure. I mean, it felt like the very people who caused the crisis were the ones being rewarded while everyone else was suffering.
Right. It was definitely a point of contention. And Airlie argues that those huge salaries and bonuses that are paid to some executives, they can actually be really demotivating and counterproductive. He even cites research that shows that when financial rewards become too large, they can actually backfire and hinder performance.
That's so interesting. Like, there's a tipping point where more money doesn't actually equal better results.
Yeah, it's like the pressure to, justify those massive payouts can actually backfire, and it leads to, like, poor decision making and a focus on those short-term gains rather than, long-term sustainability.
Yeah.
It's another example of how our irrationality can have these, like, really far-reaching consequences.
It's a reminder that incentives matter, for sure. But when they get too extreme or too distorted, they can create all sorts of unintended consequences.
Too much of a good thing.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Airlie then kind of shifts his focus to those challenges of globalization, arguing that this interconnectedness, it can be, both really beneficial, but also kind of risky. He points out that globalization, yes, it has led to this increase in trade and economic growth, but it's also made us way more vulnerable to those systemic shocks, like we saw with the financial crisis.
Like, we're all in the same boat now.
Yeah.
For better or worse. A crisis in one part of the world, it can really quickly ripple out and affect everyone.
Exactly. And he argues that we need to find ways to balance, those benefits of global integration with this need for more resilience and stability. It's a complex issue with, like, no easy answers.
It sounds like we need, like, a global approach to managing these systemic risks, Something that really takes into account our, like, shared humanity and how interconnected we all are.
Yeah, it's a challenging but essential task for sure. And in like the concluding section of the book, Airlie makes this like really passionate plea for a more realistic and humane approach to economics.
Oh, I like the sound of that. It does feel like we could use a little more humanity in our economic systems.
I agree. He argues that we need to acknowledge our limitations, our biases, our inherent irrationality, both as individuals and as like a society. He calls for a shift from those like traditional economic models, the
Yeah.
ones that assume we're all perfectly rational, to ones that actually incorporate insights from, behavioral economics, psychology, things like that.
So he's advocating for an economics that's more grounded in reality, one that takes into account, like, the messiness of human behavior.
Exactly. He believes that by understanding how we actually make decisions, not just, how we should make decisions in theory, we can design better policies,
Hmm.
create more effective institutions, and ultimately make choices that lead to greater well-being for ourselves, and for society.
It's a powerful message of hope and a call to action. It's about, recognizing that we're not just these, like, cogs in a machine. We're human beings with emotions and biases and, a whole lot of irrationality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And by embracing that irrationality, by understanding it and working with it, I think we can create a better world for ourselves, and for future generations.
Okay, before we wrap up, I have to ask about one more experiment. Ariely talks about this study where they offered people, get this, free beer at a brewery. But here's the twist. Some got to choose from a menu while others had to, like, announce their orders out loud. I have a feeling this is going to be good. What happened?
Well, as you might have guessed, those who ordered publicly, with everyone watching them, they went for more variety, right? Even if it meant choosing beers they didn't even really like.
It's like they were more concerned with, like, appearing sophisticated or adventurous than with, like, actually enjoying the beer. It's that social pressure thing again.
Totally. We want to project this certain image, even if it means sacrificing our own enjoyment. It's a reminder that social context can have this huge influence on our decisions, even in, those simple situations. We're constantly navigating those social dynamics, trying to fit in, stand out, signal something about ourselves.
It's like those carefully curated social media posts, right? Where we just present this, like, highlight reel of our lives, even if it's not, entirely accurate.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the role of social signaling in our decision making and, becoming more conscious of those choices that we're making, both online and offline.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into predictably irrational, what are the key takeaways here? I mean, it seems like we're all just these, like, walking bundles of contradictions,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Capable of incredible rationality and, like, baffling irrationality.
We are. But the good news is, by understanding these predictable patterns of irrationality, we can start to make, more conscious, informed, and ultimately better choices. We can learn to recognize those mental shortcuts, those emotional biases, those social pressures that are influencing our thinking, all the time.
It's like having this secret decoder ring for the human mind. We can start to see through those marketing ploys, those social pressures, those impulsive urges that can lead us astray.
Absolutely. And it's, an ongoing journey. There's always more to learn about ourselves and, how we make decisions.
So, dear listeners, we'll leave you with this final thought. What aspects of your life could you improve by, maybe applying the principles of predictable irrationality? Are there choices you're making that aren't serving you well? What small changes can you make, even today, to nudge yourself toward a more fulfilling, meaningful life?
Go forth and experiment. Challenge your assumptions. Embrace your irrationality. And above all, remember, you are not alone. We're all in this together, this wacky, wonderful world of human decision-making.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Predictably Irrational. We'll see you next time for another exploration of the human mind, all its quirks and complexities.